Something happened around a fire deep in the ancient past that changed everything. Not the fire itself. Fire was already old news by the time this moment occurred, already embedded in ancient human life as the central technology of survival and social gathering. Not the people sitting around it, a small group, 15 or 20 individuals doing what ancient humans did every evening after the day's work was done. Just sitting, talking in whatever proto-linguistic form communication took at that particular point in human history. Watching the flames. And then someone did something with their hands. Maybe they started tapping a rhythm on their thigh. Maybe they struck two rocks together in a pattern that was not tool-making, not functional, not directed toward any practical outcome. Maybe they picked up a hollow bone that had been lying near the fire and blew across its opening without quite meaning to, and something happened to the air inside it that produced a sound that was not a word, not an animal call, not any sound that the natural world around them produced, something new. Something that existed only because a specific human breath had moved through a specific human-made object in a specific way. And the people around the fire stopped talking. Not in alarm, not in fear, in something else, in the specific quality of arrested attention that human beings direct toward something that is simultaneously unfamiliar and immediately, inexplicably meaningful. Something that touches a part of the nervous system that ordinary events do not reach. Music had begun. Or something that would eventually become music, and the world was permanently different for it. The question of how ancient humans actually discovered music is not just a question about the origins of an art form, it is a question about the architecture of the human mind, about what kind of brain is capable of creating and responding to organized sound in the way that humans do, and about how a capacity that appears to serve no direct survival function became one of the most universal and most deeply embedded features of human culture in every society that has ever been studied. The answer involves biology, archaeology, comparative cognition, and some of the most extraordinary physical objects ever found in the ancient record. Let's get into it. Let's start with the biology, because the capacity for music is not something ancient humans invented from scratch. It was built into the architecture of a nervous system that evolved for other reasons entirely, and the music emerged from that architecture the way water finds a path down a hillside. Not because anyone planned it, but because the terrain made it inevitable. The human auditory system is one of the most sophisticated sound processing systems in the animal kingdom. It can distinguish thousands of different pitches, track multiple simultaneous sound streams, detect subtle changes in timing with millisecond precision, and extract meaningful patterns from complex acoustic environments with a speed and accuracy that no artificial system has yet fully replicated. This precision evolved primarily in service of two things: detecting and processing the sounds of other humans, voices, emotional signals, communicative intent, and detecting and processing environmental sounds relevant to survival, predator movement, weather changes, the acoustic landscape of a known territory. But this sophisticated auditory system turned out to have a secondary consequence that its evolutionary origins did not predict. When sounds are organized into patterns, when their pitches form relationships with each other, when their timing creates rhythms, when their structure has the kind of predictable organization that the pattern-seeking human brain finds deeply satisfying, the auditory system does not simply detect this organization neutrally. It responds to it emotionally, physiologically, with the release of specific neurochemicals and the activation of specific brain circuits that are associated with reward, bonding, and emotional processing. This response is not learned. It is not culturally constructed in any fundamental sense. Infants who have never been exposed to any cultural musical tradition show preferences for consonant over dissonant sound combinations, show rhythmic entrainment to regular beats, and show differential emotional responses to sounds with different musical properties. The human nervous system comes pre-installed with a sensitivity to musical organization that does not require cultural transmission to activate. The brain regions activated by music overlap significantly with the regions activated by other primary rewards: food, social bonding, sexual pleasure, through the dopaminergic reward system. Music activates the nucleus accumbens, the amygdala, the prefrontal cortex, and the cerebellum in patterns that are distinct from ordinary sound processing. The chills that music can produce, the specific physiological response called frisson, or skin orgasm, that musicians and music lovers know well, are mediated by the same neurochemical pathways as other intense rewarding experiences. Ancient humans had this system, fully, completely, in exactly the operational form it takes in modern humans. The brain that responds to music the way modern brains respond to music was the brain that ancient humans carried. The capacity was there, waiting for something to activate it. Let's talk about where music most likely came from, because the origin story is more interesting and more multi-stranded than most people expect. The first and most fundamental strand is rhythm. Of all the elements of music, rhythm is the one with the deepest biological roots and the most obvious natural precursors. The human body is a rhythmic system. The heartbeat, the breath cycle, the footfall of walking, the nursing rhythm of infant feeding, sleep cycles, the circadian rhythms of waking and sleeping. The human organism is immersed in rhythm from before birth, in the regular pulse of the maternal heartbeat that the fetus hears throughout gestation. This embodied rhythmicity means that human beings are naturally attuned to rhythmic patterns in a way that extends beyond simple detection. We synchronize to rhythms automatically, tapping our feet to a beat, nodding to a rhythm, feeling the pull toward physical response when rhythmic sounds are present. This is called entrainment, and it is not a cultural behavior. It is a fundamental neurological response that appears in human infants, in people with severe cognitive disabilities who cannot perform complex cognitive tasks, and across all human cultures, including those with no contact with Western musical traditions. In the ancient context, the most obvious sources of rhythmic sound were percussive, striking objects together, slapping surfaces, stamping feet. The step from the incidental rhythmic sounds of work and movement to the deliberate production of rhythmic patterns for their own sake is a small one, and it was almost certainly taken many times independently across many ancient human communities, simply because the human brain finds rhythmic patterns rewarding in ways that motivate their deliberate production. The second strand is vocal music, the production of organized sound through the human voice. Every ancient human had a voice. Every ancient human used that voice for communication. The transition from communicative vocal sound to musical vocal sound, from language to song, is not a categorical leap. It is a gradation. The prosodic features of language, its rhythm, its pitch contours, its patterns of stress and intonation, are already musical in a fundamental sense. Exaggerating those features, extending them, organizing them into repeated patterns, is not a quantum jump to a new behavior. It is an elaboration of something that was already present in ancient vocal communication. Infant-directed speech, the specific vocal register that adults across all cultures use when speaking to infants, has specifically musical properties. Higher pitch, exaggerated intonation contours, slower tempo, more regular rhythm. The lullaby is probably the oldest form of organized vocal music, and it is almost certainly older than any other musical form because it is the one most directly tied to an ancient survival behavior, calming an infant, that makes its musical properties functionally rather than just aesthetically motivated. Now let's talk about the archaeological evidence, because we do not have to rely entirely on inference. The physical record of ancient music making is older and richer than most people realize. The oldest confirmed musical instruments in the archaeological record are bone flutes found in the Swabian Jura region of southern Germany. The two most significant are a flute made from a griffin vulture wing bone and a flute made from mammoth ivory, both found at sites in the Swabian Jura and both dating to approximately 40,000 to 43,000 years ago. Let me give you a moment to fully register what those objects represent. 40,000 years ago, a person sat down with a griffin vulture wing bone and carefully produced 4 holes in it at specific spacings that would generate specific pitch intervals when air was blown across the opening. This was not an accident. This was not the result of random experimentation that happened to produce a functional musical instrument. This required an understanding pre-existing, already developed, of the relationship between hole placement and pitch. Someone who made this flute already knew how it worked, at least in practical empirical terms. The knowledge of how to make a functional flute was already part of their cultural repertoire, which means the tradition of flute making was older than the oldest flute we have found. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. The 40,000-year-old flutes of the Swabian Jura are not the beginning of the story. They are a snapshot of a tradition that was already established by the time those specific instruments were made. The mammoth ivory flute is particularly remarkable because it represents a manufacturing challenge of significant complexity. Mammoth ivory is not a naturally hollow material like a bird's wing bone. It required a craftsperson to split the ivory, carefully hollow out 2 halves, shape the bore to the appropriate dimensions, cut the finger holes at calculated positions, and then join the 2 halves together in a way that was sufficiently airtight to function as a wind instrument. The reconstructed mammoth ivory flute plays. Researchers have made functional replicas, and it plays well with a range of notes sufficient for melodic complexity. The care invested in making this instrument is striking. The maker had access to a range of materials but chose to work in one of the most difficult. The resulting instrument must have been considered worth the extraordinary effort. Music at 43,000 years ago was already important enough to justify that investment, but 40,000 to 43,000 years old is not the oldest evidence of ancient music. There are older claims that are worth examining. At a site in Slovenia called Divje Babe, archaeologists in 1995 found a cave bear femur with 2 circular holes in it that were interpreted by some researchers as the finger holes of an ancient flute dating to approximately 60,000 years ago, which would make it a Neanderthal artifact, since the site's age and associated species place it firmly in Neanderthal territory. If the Divje Babe object is indeed a flute, it would push confirmed musical instrument making back by 20,000 years and attribute it to a species other than anatomically modern humans. The Divje Babe claim is contested. Skeptical researchers have argued that the holes could have been produced by carnivore gnawing. Bears and hyenas are known to produce holes in bones through chewing that can resemble deliberately made holes in both shape and placement. The debate has not been definitively resolved, and the object's status as a musical instrument remains uncertain. But the possibility that Neanderthals were making music is not as counterintuitive as it might seem. Neanderthals had the anatomical requirements for vocal music. Their hyoid bones and vocal tract anatomy were closely similar to those of modern humans, suggesting comparable vocal range and control. They had the cognitive capacity for cultural transmission and deliberate artifact production. They lived in social groups that would have provided the contexts in which music serves its most important social functions. Whether or not the Divje Babe object was a flute, the evidence for Neanderthal cognitive and social sophistication is extensive enough that the possibility of Neanderthal music is not dismissed seriously by researchers. Let's talk about what music was actually for in the ancient context, because the why of ancient music is as important as the when and the how, and the answer is more functionally grounded than simply, it was beautiful. The most well-supported hypothesis for the primary ancient function of music is social bonding. Robin Dunbar, the anthropologist who proposed the social brain hypothesis and the idea that language evolved as a form of social grooming, has argued that music evolved as a way to extend the bonding effects of physical grooming to larger groups simultaneously. Physical grooming in other primates, the picking through each other's fur that chimpanzees and gorillas spend significant time doing, releases endorphins in both the groomer and the groomee, and is the primary mechanism through which primate social bonds are maintained and strengthened. It works, but it has a scaling limit. You can only groom one individual at a time, which means grooming can maintain bonds in groups of a certain size but becomes insufficient as group size increases. Humans live in larger social groups than other primates, and language, while more efficient than grooming for some purposes, does not produce the same endorphin-mediated bonding effects. Music, and specifically communal music making, including synchronized drumming, communal singing, and rhythmic group movement, does produce these effects. Synchronized rhythmic activity with others produces endorphin release, generates feelings of social connectedness, and bonds participants to each other through shared physiological experience. A community that sings and drums and dances together is a community whose members are neurochemically bonded to each other through the shared musical experience. This is why music in ancient contexts was almost certainly not primarily a solo, private activity. It was communal. It happened around fires, in groups, with multiple participants contributing voice, percussion, and movement. The individual experience of music, the private, headphones in, emotionally immersive solo listening that characterizes much modern music consumption, is a culturally recent development. The ancient music experience was collective, participatory, and socially bonding in ways that served the same community cohesion functions that grooming served in smaller primate groups. Let's talk about the relationship between music and ritual, because in the ancient world, these two things were not separate domains. They were deeply intertwined, and understanding that intertwining is essential for understanding why music became so culturally central so quickly. We have established in other discussions that ancient humans had rich ritual and ceremonial lives, that they used specific places, specific times, specific behaviors to mark significant transitions, to communicate with the invisible forces they believed governed their lives, and to maintain the community's shared framework of meaning. Music was embedded in this ritual practice from very early in its development, almost certainly because of its specific effects on human consciousness. Music can alter consciousness. This is not metaphorical. Sustained exposure to rhythmic music, particularly drumming at specific tempos, produces measurable changes in brainwave activity, reduces activity in the default mode network, and can produce states that feel qualitatively different from ordinary waking consciousness. The specific states produced by sustained rhythmic music are the same states associated with shamanic trance practice. The sense of dissolution of the boundary between self and environment, the heightened emotional responsiveness, the experience of unusual perceptual phenomena. Ancient humans who discovered the consciousness-altering properties of sustained rhythmic music, whether through deliberate experimentation or through the accidental discovery that certain drumming patterns produced unusual states during communal gatherings, would have had an immediately obvious interpretive framework for those states. In a world where invisible agents were believed to operate behind the visible surface of events, a practice that consistently produced altered states would be understood as a portal to those invisible dimensions. Music became ritual technology because it was, in the most literal neurological sense, a technology for accessing states of consciousness that felt like encounters with the sacred. The specific acoustic properties of ancient ritual sites support this connection. Researchers studying the acoustics of ancient painted caves, Chauvet, Lascaux, Altamira, and others, have found that the areas within these caves where the highest densities of paintings appear tend to be the areas with the most resonant acoustic properties, chambers and passages where sound echoes and reverberates in ways that amplify and transform vocal and percussive sounds. The painted areas were, in many cases, also the most acoustically impressive areas. This correlation is too consistent to be coincidental. Ancient people making music in these resonant cave chambers, drumming, singing, and hearing those sounds reflected and amplified by the surrounding rock, were having an experience that was both musically and acoustically extraordinary. The reverberant, echoing sounds of music in a deep cave are not the same as the same sounds in the open air. They have a quality that has been described by experimental subjects who have experienced reconstructed ancient cave acoustics as uncanny, otherworldly, specifically suited to the kind of boundary-dissolving experience that ancient ritual sought to produce. The music and the paintings were part of the same thing. They were not separate forms of ancient expression that happened to share the same physical spaces. They were components of integrated ritual experiences, each enhancing the effect of the other. Let's talk about the diversity of ancient musical instruments, because the bone flutes of the Swabian Jura were not the only kind of sound-producing device that ancient humans developed. Percussion was almost certainly earlier than melodic instruments, and the variety of percussive technologies available to ancient humans was significant. Rocks of specific materials, particularly flint and quartzite, produce distinctive sounds when struck together that are different from the sounds of other materials and that have musical properties. Clear, bright tones with specific resonant characteristics. The discovery that certain rocks sounded musically interesting when struck was almost certainly made very early in ancient human history, simply because rock working was among the most universal ancient activities, and the acoustic properties of rocks are immediately perceptible. Ancient clapping stones, pairs of stones whose acoustic properties suggest they were used for percussion rather than tool making, have been found at several sites, though the identification of these objects as deliberate percussion instruments rather than ordinary tool-making debris requires specific evidence about their properties and context. The challenge of identifying ancient percussion instruments is precisely that rocks struck together for music look very similar to rocks struck together for tool-making. Animal skins stretched over frames or hollow objects produce drums when struck, a technology that requires only materials that ancient humans had routinely available, and that is found in every studied traditional culture worldwide. The near universality of drum technology across human cultures, and the fact that drums are among the most ancient instruments in every tradition where their history can be traced, suggests a very early origin for this technology. Drums do not preserve well in the archaeological record, but their universal presence in documented traditional cultures argues for ancient antiquity. Rattles, containers with small objects inside that produce sound when shaken, are similarly ancient in all probability, and similarly invisible in the deep archaeological record because the materials involved are perishable. But the cognitive simplicity of the rattle technology, putting small stones or seeds inside a hollow container, places its discovery well within the range of ancient human experimentation with sound-producing objects. There is one more dimension of the ancient music discovery story that deserves specific attention, because it connects music to what may be its most ancient function of all. Mothers sing to infants. This is universal. Every human culture that has been studied has infant-directed song. Lullabies, soothing vocalizations, rhythmic sung speech, directed at infants to calm them, comfort them, and regulate their physiological and emotional state. The properties of this infant-directed song are consistent across cultures: higher pitch than normal speech, slower tempo, more regular rhythm, more exaggerated and smooth pitch contours. These properties map almost perfectly onto the musical features that neuroscience has found to be most effective for inducing calm, positive emotional states and reducing physiological arousal. The lullaby works neurologically, measurably, cross-culturally, because it exploits exactly the auditory system properties that make music emotionally effective. And it requires no musical tradition, no instruments, no cultural transmission of musical knowledge to discover. Every mother who has tried to calm a distressed infant and found that singing works better than speaking has independently discovered the foundational principle of music, that organized, rhythmic, pitch-contoured sound has specific and powerful effects on human emotional and physiological states. If lullabies are among the oldest forms of music, and the evidence suggests they probably are, then music began not as entertainment, not as ritual, not as social bonding technology, but as the most personal and most urgent of human activities: a mother trying to comfort a child. From that beginning, from the ancient woman who discovered that the specific quality of her voice, organized in a specific rhythmic and melodic pattern, could calm a distressed infant when nothing else worked, the full complexity of human musical culture eventually grew. Through 10,000 generations of communal fireside singing, of rhythm making at seasonal gatherings, of ritual drumming in resonant cave chambers, of bone flutes crafted with painstaking precision, of the continuous elaboration and transmission of musical knowledge across the full span of ancient human history. The 43,000-year-old flute from the Swabian Jura is not the beginning. It is a waypoint in a story that started much earlier and has not yet ended. Music is as old as the specific quality of human attention to organized sound, as old as the specific human nervous system response to rhythm, as old as the first ancient mother who found that her voice, shaped in a particular way, could make a crying infant stop. And if you have ever found yourself tapping your foot to a beat without meaning to, or felt chills from a piece of music, or felt a group of strangers become momentarily more connected through a shared song, you are experiencing exactly what ancient humans discovered, however they first discovered it. The nervous system knows. It has always known.